Hello, we're back again. This is chapter 6. This is your first chapter on the skeletal system. We will talk about the skeletal system for chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9 in some way, shape, or form. Part of the fact that we're talking about this for so long, I guess it doesn't seem like so long, you have quite a few chapters you go through, is that in the human body there's 206 bones. And when you're introducing and when you're learning about 206 pieces of anatomy, each one having unique features, you have to start categorizing those 206. And one of the first ways we start categorizing is how they're formed and just general characteristics about those 206. And then we'll go into the axial, so a portion of the skeletal system that's weight bearing, has a unique function, as opposed to the appendicular, and then talk about joints themselves. So although it's several chapters, each chapter has a focus when it comes to the skeletal system. This particular chapter, the focus is how bone is formed, a kind of general idea about bone, how bone is formed, and how we think about the individual bones, how we think about them, what things we look for in them. The skeletal system does, as I said, includes 206 bones. Cartilage, so the place between the bones, and also the area where bone might attach to each other. Ligaments, which is that dense, regular connective tissue that attaches bone to bone, and tendons. A little bit. We can't really talk about bone without mentioning tendons, although we associate tendons with the muscular system, and other connective tissue. For example, muscles are going to connect to bone, so you have this idea of fascia and fascia connecting to the periosteum of bone. So that's what's included with the skeletal system. I will apologize not in advance in the fact that I do tend to talk about the skeletal system as it relates to the muscles and movement, but that it's almost impossible to separate the two. Functions of the skeletal system: general support of the entire body, so it keeps us upright. It basically defines our structure as humans, the skeletal system does, and this is a combination of the axial and the appendicular skeletal system. Storage of minerals: we think of calcium, we think of phosphorus, we think of magnesium. Minerals are stored for for the calcium needed to maintain calcium levels in blood, and for a muscle contraction, particularly think of the heart muscle contraction. But minerals are also, they're inorganic compounds that lend to our osmotic homeostasis. So osmosis, as you learned, is a matter of water moving through a semi-permeable membrane. And one of the reasons why that water moves is because of solutes inside and outside of the cell. So extracellular solutes and intracellular solutes. So minerals create those solutes, or add to the creation of those solutes, as well as minerals are cofactors in many of the body functions that we have, so that storage, so the mineral bank is the bones. Plus the bones need calcium and calcium salts to remain very, very strong, and to become and be the bones that they are, the nature of bones, the strength of bones. There's also lipids stored in bones in the hollow areas of long bones. We call it the yellow marrow. So you have lipids stored there. In the spongy bone, and I know these are words that maybe you're familiar with, maybe you're not, but you certainly will become very familiar with them. In spongy bone, at the ends of long bones, in your ribs, in your sternum, you have marrow, and it gives rise to all the formed elements, so red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Most of the formed elements are red blood cells, which is why we tend to call it red marrow, because it does have that red appearance. But understand that all the formed elements of blood are produced. Protection, certainly think of your cranial cavity and the fact that you have the brain in the cranial cavity. It makes an excellent protection for the cranial cavity. You have protection around the vertebral column, around the spinal cord, which is the vertebral column. You have protection around the reproductive organs, at least in the posterior aspect, and you do have protection around the lungs and the heart in terms of the ribs and the sternum. So there are many areas where you have protection and leverage, and this goes into the relationship between the skeletal system and the muscles. Muscles will attach to the skeletal system, and a lot of the bony processes we talk about and we define are for muscle attachments. And depending on how those muscles attach, how strong those muscles are, and their angle, I guess, this bones and their leverage will define the range of motion or the force of motion. So these are 5 primary functions of the skeletal system. And classification, again, 206 of something, each one having unique features. We want to start classifying them. And this image, I know this image needed to be cropped a little bit. It does come from your book. One of the first ways we classify bones is by their shape. And so you have the immovable joints where bones come together in the skull. They're called sutures. And that design of sutures happens over time. And that design can make some irregular bones, can make some bones that aren't in every person. They're not irregular bones. They're not bones in every person. And that's what we call sutural bones. These don't always happen. They are bones that are found in sutural joints, and they can be very small. So they can be the size of a grain of sand or as large as a quarter. And their borders are very much like a jigsaw. It's just an abnormal normal in terms of sutural bones. And then you have irregular bones, which the vertebral column are an excellent example of the irregular bones. No 2 vertebral bones are exactly alike. They're highly irregular. They actually fit together like a little jigsaw of irregular bones, and the design is the vertebrae become smaller as they go from the lumbar area to the neck area, and but they relate to each other. So they're irregular in the fact that no 2 vertebral bones are the same, but they are very regular in their ability to stack on each other. Short bones, you usually have short bones grouped together. And we see those in the bones of the wrist, the carpal bones of the wrist and the tarsal bones of the ankle, where you have multiple bones that are about as long as they are wide. That's why we get the short aspect. But they also happen to have groupings. In the carpal bones, you have 2 rows of short bones. So that tends to be something that happens with short bones. Up at the top right, you have flat bones. And they have thin parallel surfaces. Flat bones form the root of the skull, the sternum. They provide protection, but basically it's not a mystery of why they call them flat. They tend to look flat. If you take the sternum out, if you look at the sternum in lab, or if you look at the sternal bone, it looks flat. Long bones are longer than they are wide, much longer than they are wide, and certainly in comparison to short bones. You have short bones over here, long bones over here. You're going to put them in one column or another. Long bone is going to have a longer diaphysis. We think of the bones of the arm bones, the leg bones, also the bones of the fingers and toes. Are all considered long bones. They tend to be the largest bones in the body, heaviest in terms of compact bone, and of course any muscle that attaches to a long bone is going to have a large range of motion, a large force of motion. And then the last shape here is a sesamoid, which everybody has the sesamoid bone. A sesamoid bone is a bone that you find in a tendon, and the patella is the sesamoid bone that we all have. Other people can have sesamoid bones and other tendons, and sesamoid bones can be created in other tendons. They don't tend to be as useful as the patella. The patella is a very useful bone. All you have to do is have a patella that's not functioning properly, or is having some problems at that time, meaning its tracking is off, and you realize, wow, that really does a job in terms of making sure that my knee doesn't hurt when I am when I'm flexing my knee. Patella is a type of sesamoid bone, but other bones can develop in tendons. Bone markings, we'll get started on this and probably have to pick this up again on the next one. You learn quite a bit about bone markings. What they are unique features on bones. They can either elevate or depress. So they can either be impressions or depressions or grooves on a bone surface. And when you think of that, you think of something lying in there like a nerve, a vessel that lies in, and this is in a micro level the way a bone is going to be protecting. A bone is protecting a nerve or a blood vessel because it's lying in the groove of a bone. Or elevations or projections, and generally when something is elevated off of a bone, so this is something that projects off of a bone, this is where tendons are going to attach. Tendons and ligaments are going to attach to define and I guess to add to the definition, not to be the definitive definition of motion, but certainly define or add to our definition of what motion is going to be. You also have bone markings at articulations or ends of the bones where a bone is going to form a joint with another bone. Many times those projections are so that the bones can fit together in a logical way, and then you have openings or tunnels. So you can have an actual opening in a bone where a nerve or a blood vessel is going to be able to pass through that bone. Here on this particular image, in this color-coded skull is something that's fabulous, and just get used to it. We have at least one of the color-coded skulls in the lab for you to look at, and it's wonderful when you first start learning using the color-coded skull because it helps you identify the individual bones. But don't stop there, because we have far more skulls that are not color-coded. But you have an example of a process, an elevated projection, and I think I will pick it up there on the next one because I'm running out of time.